Hey guys, so this video is titled GX10, GX100 EQ Masterclass. But honestly, the concepts that I want to discuss here can be applied in absolutely any musical situation and pretty much apply to any multi-effects ever produced in the history of man. So Equalisation is a utility that allows you to basically adjust the sonic frequencies or the frequencies within the audio spectrum. Now, the audio spectrum is basically from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz, and the measurement of Hertz is actually named after a German physicist, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz. So, now that we've got the history lesson out of the way, what is EQ exactly? So essentially, EQ comes in a lot of different forms from the basic guitar tone knob. So for an example, the tone knob on a guitar more specifically would be what's known as a low pass filter. So the low pass filter essentially allows you to attenuate the high frequency. So if I was to play the guitar, as I roll that tone knob off, it's actually cutting or reducing the actual high frequencies. So you can hear that it gets a lot less bright in sound. And even amplifiers contain EQ in its most basic form, being in the form of a bass, mid, and treble. And then of course you've got a lot of amps that have a presence knob, which is the upper high frequencies. So that's EQ in its most basic form, but of course you would probably be familiar with the terms graphic EQ and parametric EQ, and these are the two most commonly used EQ or equalization forms that we will discuss today. And later in the video, I'll show you how those two types of EQs work specifically on the GX10 and the GX100. However, as mentioned, the concepts that I'll discuss will actually be able to be applied to absolutely any musical situation. So if you've got a quad cortex or an Axe-Fx or an old Boss unit, you know, EQ works pretty much in exactly the same way across the board. But once you understand how EQ works, you'll be better equipped to get the most out of your guitar sound or have your guitar sitting within a live mix or in a recording much better. I mentioned before that the frequency range is measured in Hertz. So this actually can be referred to as cycles. So 20 Hertz, 20 cycles, means that the sound wave oscillates 20 times per second. So it's quite a slow oscillation. The higher the frequency, the faster the oscillations. So when we get right up to 20,000 Hertz, that means it's oscillating 20,000 times per second. The term EQ or equalization refers to being able to adjust the frequencies within the audio spectrum to balance them out. So for an example, if there is high frequencies that are a little bit too harsh, you could reduce them or cut, this is known as cutting, and you can balance the sound so that you're making the audio spectrum more equal. So hence the name equalization. So we're going to have a look at how we're going to do that. But first of all, let's talk about when you're EQing your guitar, for an example. When you're sitting home playing in your bedroom or in a home studio, you'll be tempted to wind in a lot of bass, and your sound will actually be a lot different to what it would be if you were to actually put it in the mix of a band or if you're playing live. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail when we get into the software. But essentially, when you're EQing your guitar, you need to consider where it's sitting within the mix with other instruments. Now, if we're looking at, say, a stereo spectrum, okay, so this being dead center, and then we've got fully left and fully right. Generally within an audio mix where you've got a bass guitar, a vocalist, drums and other instrumentation, they will all occupy a certain area within the audio spectrum so that they're not competing with each other. So what will often happen is things like, for an example, a male vocal is renowned as being a mid-frequency instrument. So the male vocal would typically be dead center, so that when you're listening, say in headphones, you would hear the singer or the vocalist right in the center of the mix. guitars, so that they're not competing with the vocalist, would usually be panned left or right. And then, they may occupy any part of the actual stereo audio spectrum. Now, let's talk about panning for an example. So panning, the word pan actually refers to panorama. Okay, so panorama being, if you're looking at, say, a landscape, okay, the panorama is the area around you rather than just being dead center. If you were to use a mixer or a digital audio workstation, then you would adjust where your signal sits within the stereo spectrum by using what's known as a pan pot. The pan pot is short for panoramic potentiometer. Now, I mentioned about having instrumentation not clashing with each other. So the guitar being a mid-voiced instrument would sit somewhere in the side of the stereo spectrum so that it's not clashing with the male vocal. If you had a female vocal, then it's probably not going to compete with it quite so much. Then you would have instruments such as the bass guitar. Again, the bass guitar and the kick drum share similar frequencies, but typically the kick drum may be a little bit lower frequency, so they're not going to compete with each other. And when you're EQing these two sounds together, because they both occupy normally the central part of the mix, you would actually EQ them so that the frequencies are slightly separated so that you can actually clearly hear the kick and it's not blending too much with the bass guitar. Then you would have high-end instruments like cymbals, that sort of thing. And again, they would typically be spread in the panorama from left to right, depending on how the drum kit is positioned or situated within the mix. Things like snare and hi-hats can sometimes be slightly off-cent. Often in a mix, they'll be dead center. Again, snare drums don't really occupy the same frequency exactly as some of the other instrumentations, so it's not going to clash. So these are the sorts of things that you need to consider when you're creating your guitar tone when you want it to sit within the mix. Now, I mentioned before about if you're sitting in your home studio playing guitar, it's tempting to actually put in quite a little bit of bass or bottom end to boost the signal to make it sound really full. However, the opposite is true when you're trying to get it in either a live mix or in a recording. You want to actually cut the bass frequencies so that they're not competing with the bass guitar. And we're going to look at this in the software and I'll give you some examples of that. But essentially when you're tailoring your guitar, you want more of the mid sound so that it pops out of the mix when you're actually hearing it with the other instrumentation. So now let's have a look at the two main types of EQ, being a graphic EQ and a parametric EQ. Okay, so I've just recorded a sample here which is coming directly from the GX10. Let's have a quick listen to that. Okay, so that sounds pretty balanced as it is. However, for me, I can tell that there's a few little problems that I would like to address, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But first of all, let's have a look at the EQ themselves and how it kind of applies. The first one we'll look at is the graphic EQ. Now, graphic EQ is essentially a set of sliders. Now, these sliders are usually fixed values from the bottom end, so 75 Hertz, up to the top end, on this one being 12 kilohertz or 12,000 Hertz. Now, anything that is moved usually in the positive value is known as boosting, and anything in the negative value is known as cutting. So typically when I'm EQing, I would cut or boost the frequencies until I arrive at a sound that I'm happy with. So now let's apply that process to the sample that I've got recorded here. And even though this isn't a typical heavy metal performance, let's apply a technique known as scooping the mids, which is a common technique used in heavy metal music to blend the guitar in with the rest of the band mix. So I'm going to play it through, and then you'll see me starting to scoop some of these frequencies, and you'll hear how it sounds when I toggle it on and off. Here we go. Okay, so there you go. So that's scooping the mid. So you can instantly hear the difference it makes. And if you had a couple of different guitars in a metal band, you would basically EQ them slightly different from each other so that they have some separation. And then basically, you know, scooping that out just gives it that inherent metal sound. Okay, so I'm just going to reset this back to 0. And now what if we wanted to do a solo and we wanted the solo or the lead sound to actually pop out of the mix so that it stands out from everything else? Then we would look at boosting some higher frequencies, something around, I would normally do between 2 and 3 kilohertz. However, this particular EQ doesn't have that specific EQ band, so I would probably play with the 1.5 or the 4.5. So let's have a listen there. So you can hear there's more clarity now in the actual sound itself. However, for me, there is a little bit of a low-end rumble, which typically if it was played within the context of a band mix, I would want to cut some of that bottom end. And this is where these high-pass filters and low-pass filters come into play. So the low-pass basically allows us to attenuate the high frequencies, similar to the guitar tone knob. So have a listen there. So I typically wouldn't usually cut a lot of the top end, but what I am really hearing here is this bit of a low end rumble. So you'll hear how much the entire guitar sound clears up when I actually bring the high pass filter up. Now I'm going to reset the bands here so you're only hearing the high pass filter. Okay, here we go. So you might be thinking to yourself that that sounds a little bit thin, but believe me, when it's in the context of a full band mix, it will in fact clean up the entire mix. You won't have that bottom end, what they're known as muddiness, that's cluttering up and competing with the bass frequencies. Your guitar's going to stand out a lot more in the mix. And when you're playing live, the first thing any audio engineer would do to your guitar sound is to apply a high pass filter. They would usually use what's known as a low cut, and they would actually basically tailor your sound so that it fits into the guitar mix. But for your own purposes, if you're doing your own recording, then this is a technique that you would use that would all of a sudden clear up that guitar sound and make it stand out within the context of a full band mix. So that's the graphic EQ, and now we're going to have a look at the Tone Studio software, and we'll see how the actual GX10 and the GX100 graphic EQ works. Okay, so here's the graphic EQ in the GX10 and the GX100. And again, you can see, as mentioned before, that it is fixed frequencies. Although we don't have sliders like we do in a typical graphic EQ, They essentially start at 0 dB, and anything below 0 dB is cutting or reducing the slider, and anything above 0 dB is boosting or raising the actual frequency. So the frequency range, or the set frequencies within a graphic EQ, may be slightly different from one graphic EQ to another in different effects units. However, they usually cover from the low frequencies right up to the high frequencies. You can see we've actually got the 16 kilohertz here, which is usually beyond what most human hearing can actually hear, but you'll find that it will give the sound some presence if you are actually boosting, or if your guitar sound is way too shrill or too bright, you can actually reduce this frequency to actually reduce the perceived brightness of the sound. And of course, if you are cutting a lot of frequencies here, then you've got a level control where you can actually boost the overall level. And sometimes you may use this as an actual solo boost. So as an example, if you're raising like 4K and 2K, and if I was to play this now, so there's no delay or reverb on there for my solo, but at least you can hear how it's actually making the notes stand out a lot more. And of course, if I wanted to use this as a boost, I could actually raise the level here so that when it's toggling on and off, so I could in fact assign the graphic EQ to a pedal assignment so that I can turn it on when I actually turn on my delay and my reverb, so that then all of a sudden I've got a solo boost. Graphic EQ is probably the easiest to initially understand because you've just got those fixed frequencies and they can either be cut or boosted, and then you've got the overall level control. Now, it's not the most flexible way of EQing, and for that reason we're going to look at parametric EQ. Now, parametric EQ has a bit more control and the frequencies can actually be tailored to your sound, and we're going to look at that now. Now we're looking at parametric EQ, and this is the basic EQ that is in my Cubase. And at the moment you can see the visual representation here doesn't show any frequencies being adjusted. It starts with this pre-control, which gives us the high cut and the low cut, as I mentioned before, where you can tailor the extreme high end and the low end of the signal. But then we have 4 bands that we can actually adjust, and they start with low, low mid frequency, high mid frequency, and high. And if you look at the actual frequencies themselves, they're not set frequencies like they are in a graphic. We can actually change the frequency that it's actually affecting. Now, if I want to change this low mid frequency here, first of all, I'll just turn it on. You can see it puts a little node there that I can either adjust with my mouse by clicking and dragging, or I can actually physically raise or lower the value of the gain here. And you can see the gain goes right up to 24 decibels, right down to minus 24 decibels. And now if I start playing the sample and adjusting that frequency, you'll hear what it does. So with a single frequency, I can do a scooped mid. So you can see that this is representing all the frequencies that it's adjusting. So you can see down the bottom here, we've got from 50 Hertz, 100 Hertz, 200, 500, right up to 20,000. So this is adjusting all of these frequencies with that center frequency being the most prominent. Now, this is where I come to the Q control. Now, the Q factor is synonymous with a parametric EQ because it allows you to tailor the actual shape of the curve. Now, if I wanted to affect lots of neighboring frequencies, I would keep the Q control to 0. However, if I want to affect a specific frequency, I can raise the Q factor, and now you can see that it's narrowing those frequencies. So if I put that all the way up to 12, now you can see that I can actually affect either boosting or cutting very narrow frequency ranges. So at the moment I've got it set to around about 1 kilohertz, and you can see that it is only really affecting those very close frequencies next to it. And we're going to have a listen to how this sounds. Now, of course, when I was raising the frequencies there, I raised the gain, and you can see this red indicator showing that I've actually distorted or clipped the signal. So you have to be careful when you're raising the sound, because it will actually raise the volume. So what I would typically do is make sure that the gain is adjusted, or change the master level of the effect so that it is not distorting the signal. But you can hear how I can actually tailor the actual sound. If I've got a specific frequency that is sounding a little bit harsh, I can actually zone in on that one frequency, and I can probably cut it, or I can boost it. And this gives me a lot more control than what the graphic EQ can, because I can, as mentioned before, I can reduce the Q factor so that I can now affect neighboring frequencies. So you can see that I could do a low end adjustment there, but then I've got these other frequencies. I could turn on the high mid frequency, and then I could maybe raise the sound here. I'm going to reduce the Q, and maybe I'll just narrow it down a little bit. So now you can see I'm able to really customize the actual EQ to what I want, because I'm not limited to set frequencies. Okay, so that's in my DAW, but what about the GX100 or GX10? So here's the parametric EQ that I've already got in this preset. So you can hear the difference there clearly, but let me just turn that off altogether, and let's bring a new instance of the parametric EQ in, so we can start from scratch. So we spoke about the high cut and the low cut earlier. Now the low cut, obviously we could bring that up to eradicate some of that low end rumble. Now it's probably a little bit too much, maybe just around about 125. Now you may be thinking that that sounds a little bit thin, but believe me, when you get it into the context of a band mix or a recording, it will sound and sit beautifully within the mix and sound nice and clear. So from here we want to utilize the parameters like I showed you in Cubase. Okay, so now we've got a low gain adjustment, which will give us an overall boost or cut of the low frequencies. And again, I wouldn't tend to adjust this really, because I've already cut the low frequencies here, because I want the guitar to sit within the mix. So similarly, the high gain, if we want to make the overall sound brighter, then we could utilize that. But I'm more interested in utilizing the low mid frequencies, the high mid frequencies, and then using the Q controls to actually control how much of the frequencies it's actually picking up. So now we've got an overall level control here, and if I just adjust that, it's actually making level adjustments, but it's not actually EQing, because I haven't actually applied any EQ yet. So as an example, let's say we want to have a boost for our solo. We might stick around anywhere sort of the 2 to 4K range, and in this case I'm going to make it say 3.15 kilohertz. Now I'm going to adjust the high range mid so that it's actually affecting neighboring frequencies, so we could probably keep it at 1 and that's fine. And then we can adjust the high mid gain to adjust how much of that frequency range we want to boost. So let me play some guitar and you can have a listen to how it affects it. So if I turn this off as I'm playing, you'll hear the difference that it makes. Now, I haven't done much of an adjustment, but already you can hear how it's really providing a lot more clarity to the overall sound. And if I wanted to, I could use this low mid frequency to also boost some frequencies. We might want to put a little bit of the low mids in. So again, I'm going to adjust the Q a little bit. I want this to be a little bit narrower, and then we'll adjust the gain. So for me, that's already providing a lot more clarity, and I know for a fact that when it's in the context of a band mix, it will be popping out a little bit more than what it was before. And of course, I've got no reverb or delay on that yet. So if I was to engage my current number on the actual pedal itself, so now... So for me, that's a pretty decent solo sound. So that's parametric EQ. Now, of course, understanding that you can adjust the frequency or tailor the specific frequency that you want to adjust, and then by using the Q control, actually tailor how much of the surrounding frequencies that you're adjusting and then boosting or cutting, then you'll be able to get the most effective use out of it. And for me, the parametric EQ is a lot more powerful than the graphic EQ, but obviously there's a little bit more of a learning curve involved, but understanding this, and hopefully this video is helping you to understand how to control those settings and get the most out of it. Let's talk about where to actually place EQ within the effects chain. So it's worth mentioning that EQ will affect anything that comes after it in the effects chain. So for this reason, if, for an example, you were using a guitar that you didn't like the sound of, or you wanted to change the way the pickups sound, then you would apply an EQ before it actually goes into the amplifier. You can see I've got the parametric EQ, and if I move that in front of the overdrive and the amp block, now any adjustments I make will adjust the sound of the actual guitar. So let's have a listen to the difference in the sound as I'm playing between before the amp and after the amp. That's a pretty big difference, right? So as mentioned, EQing before it hits the amplifier will be a lot more subtle, but it's a really good way of being able to shape the way the guitar is sounding before it actually hits the amp. And a lot of times if you're using, say, a guitar that's using pickups that are not very good pickups, then you're able to actually get it sounding better before it actually gets amplified. And of course you can apply a second EQ after the amp. In this case I've got a graphic EQ here, but I could actually bring that out and I could actually put another parametric EQ in. So let's bring that down and pop that before the distortion. So now I've got a pre-EQ. Now don't confuse this with parametric EQ being the P-EQ. When I say pre-EQ, that refers to it being before the actual amp block. So the pre-EQ is what's shaping the sound of the guitar before it actually hits the amp, and then I'm able to affect the sound after the amplifier with this second EQ. So this is typically how you would shape the guitar sound from before it hits the amplifier to then what it sounds like after the amplifier. And of course you could have a separate EQ again for when you're engaging it for a solo. So just looking at this preset, I've got my pre-EQ and then the EQ that I'm using to shape my rhythm tone, but now I want to apply a third EQ for my solo tone. So I'm going to bring another parametric EQ in. Just going to engage my current number switch and you'll see the delay and the reverb turn on. So this is what it sounds like. And now for me that already sounds okay, but if I wanted to accentuate the mid frequency so that my solo pops out of the mix, or in the context of a live performance, I might want it to stand out a bit more. So let's see what I could do there. Now you see that I'm playing with the low mid Q here so that I can just broaden out those frequencies or tailor them. So if I want to accentuate just the 500 Hertz frequency, I would actually narrow them down by raising the Q value. Now it's very subtle, but I can just sort of hear it in the studio monitors here. So now that's distorting, so that's way too much gain, so I'll just bring it back. And now I'll toggle it on and off, just so you can hear, because it's quite a subtle adjustment, but you can hear it, and when it's in the context of a mix, you will actually find that it will just allow the guitar just to sort of stand above a little bit. And of course, once I'm happy with the sound, what I want to do then is assign the EQ that I've just applied so that it turns on and off with the current number. So I'm just going to go into Control Expression, and then I'll create a new assignment here. We'll turn it on, Edit. The target category is going to be that Parametric EQ 3, and I want it to be on and off and assigned to the current number, and it's going to be a toggle. So now I'll just hit the switch on my GX100 and you'll see that it's toggling on and off those three components. So I've got the Parametric EQ 3, the delay and the reverb all toggling on and off. So believe me, that will stand out in a mix, no problem at all. So there you go. That's a lot to take in, but hopefully if you're new to guitar multi-effects or guitar in general, that you've gotten some value out of this video. I really think that EQ is a really effective tool to get the most out of your guitar sound, and any multi-effects, again, you can apply these same concepts or principles and they work in very similar ways. So thanks for watching, really appreciate it. If you have gotten some value out of this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will catch you on the next one. Thanks and bye for now.